Welcome everyone, Christine here on Serious Gaming with a discussion on the 5 most undesirable classes to play in World of Warcraft: The Burning Crusade Classic whenever it does come out. We don't know. Could it be May or June? Could it be the middle of summer next year or late August, early September? We just don't know. We have rumors, we have speculation, but we don't know. But when it does come out, there will be some classes that will struggle to find 5-man dungeon spots, raid spots, guild spots, for any number of reasons. Now, this isn't to say that the classes on this particular list are weak, but because of the way the game is designed, because of the way certain classes are far more powerful than others or bring so much to the table in terms of buffs or debuffs, certain classes are going to have an easy time, certain classes are going to have a difficult time. Now look, if you're a good enough player, you can play whatever the hell you want, and if you have the experience, if you have, let's say, the CV, if you want to call it that, having played in multiple WoW guilds, you can play whatever you want and you can find a spot, but that doesn't mean there isn't some difficulty. It can be frustrating trying to find a 5-man pug to get your gear. It can be very frustrating to find a guild if you're struggling with that and having to compete against a lot of other people, or competing just in general for one spot in a guild. And that's absolutely the case for a number of classes on this list, or for certain specs on this list. Starting at number 5, we have the class that also finished at number 5 on the 5 most desirable, which is Hunters. Now, Hunters are a strong class. They have the single highest DPS potential on single target in the entire game. No class can come anywhere close to the damage that a Hunter can pull out on a single target in the game. A properly geared, well-played Hunter will beat every single class in the game on single target throughout the entire game, from tier 4, tier 5, tier 6. There is only one exception to this rule, and that's in late tier 5 with arcane mages. That's the only exception in the entire game, just because of the way their damage scales with the 4-set bonus, or the 2-set bonus, then 4-set, Morgrim, Tidewalker, Trinket. But that's the only exception to the rule. Outside of that, Hunters should be at the top of the damage meter. That's how it goes. On top of that, Hunters do have an easy gearing process. They can do a lot of damage with bad gear. And the gear that they want pre-raid isn't really that difficult to obtain. You don't have to farm thousands upon thousands of gold for things like Spellstrike, Frozen Shadow Weave, or Spellfire, or Primal Mooncloth, White Mant. You don't have to worry about those kind of things. You have an easy gearing process. You can do a lot of damage as a Hunter. You're very useful to a raid, be it misdirection, or if you're playing survival, you obviously offer a damage debuff to your raid, which is useful to all physical DPSers in a raid, and also, of course, for protection warriors and feral druids. So those kind of things are important. But what's the catch? Why are Hunters on this list? Well, they are so powerful that they're very popular for people that know how the meta is going to shape out, how many Hunters are going to be needed by guilds. Combine out the fact that Hunters are very easy to level, very easy to gear, very strong, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to play a lot of Hunters. And that means there's going to be competition for the raid spots from everything, and dungeon spots even. I mean, you don't really want more than one Hunter in a 5-man group, right? You don't want that kind of competition, so that alone can be frustrating. Then you have the raiding situation from 10 men to 25 men. This isn't like with Classic, or let's say the Warriors, where you can have as many Warriors as you want in Classic. You generally won't be able to stack your raid to the degree that you want with Warriors. There is a limit to how many Hunters you want in a Burning Crusade raid. There might not be a limit with Warlocks or with Shamans, but there is a limit with Hunters, and that obviously will cause issues for a lot of people playing this particular class that want to find a guild if they don't have one already. It's nowhere close to the issues that all the other classes on this list have, but it is something for people to be aware of, especially because right now there are a lot of people that do have a Hunter, even if it's a Hunter alt in Classic, and obviously we're going to transfer our characters over to Burning Crusade Classic. When that happens, you can expect a lot of competition from that. You could say they're the flavor of the month class, along with Shamans and Warlocks, and that's absolutely true. The 3 most popular classes, the free classes that a lot of people will look at, well, these guys are really strong and desired. Hunters just can't stack in a raid the same way warlocks and shamans can, and that is to their disfavor. And number 4 on this list, in terms of limited raid spots, talking about that, we have mages. Now, mages are a strong class. They do good damage, they have a lot to offer to a group, to a raid, from decursing, polymorph, counterspell, arcane brilliance, all that. Improved Blizzard, an important slow ability that is actually very useful on many boss encounters, be it in dungeons or in raids, or dealing with dungeon trash. So all that is important. In terms of 5-mans, mages are in a pretty good spot. Almost every group in a 5-man dungeon, be it not normal or heroic, would want a mage. With some exceptions, in certain dungeons do exist, but for the most part, if you're playing a mage, you shouldn't have any issues finding a 5-man group. What you will struggle with is finding a raid group, finding a guild spot. And why is that? Because all of the things that mages can bring to the table, with the exception of decursing and polymorph, can be done by a single mage in a raid. And they're not the best damage dealers. Warlocks will win, hunters will win, easily, really, against mages. Only one exception exists to this rule, and that's with fully tier 5 geared arcane mages being the highest damage dealers in late tier 5, right? So you've done progression, you've geared people up, you're doing speed runs. In terms of the highest single target damage at that particular point, and only at that point, arcane mages are far above anyone else. Now, I do have a comment on my previous video from a fellow named Christopher who said this: if raid bosses melt as fast as they are in Classic, guilds will want more mages than they realize. Because if fights are short, mages can go arcane from the start and not have to worry about the downside of mana management. Now, here's the thing, that's not quite true. Boss fights aren't going to be quite as short in BC. Like, if you look at the numbers, the HP numbers that bosses had in Burning Crusade, and you calculate the DPS numbers, let's say a raid is doing 20k DPS, which would actually be pretty bloody high initially. If a raid is doing 20k DPS, it's going to take a bit to kill those bosses. So mana issues will exist, but here's the thing. That doesn't matter. You can deal with the mana issues if the arcane mages are doing a lot of damage, which they can do with full tier 5. Force it tier 5, with Morgrim Tidewalker Trinket, arcane mages smash the damage meters. But even that's not enough. Sure, in that situation you could have 2, maybe even 3 mages, but you would have a lot of competition for those kind of mage spots. Especially because of the extremely large number of mages right now. Mage alts, mage mains, in Classic, very popular class. Lots of people have mage characters. You can imagine the kind of competition that you will have as a mage in the Burning Crusade Classic, especially for a guild spot. That's going to exist. It already exists in Classic, actually. It's not really going to change. In fact, it's probably going to get worse when Burning Crusade Classic comes out, because at most, in the best possible scenario for mages, you'd have 3. Realistically, you're looking at 1 or 2. And you can imagine the kind of competition that's going to be for those 2 raid spots. Now, granted, 2 arcane mages with Mana Tide, Shadow Priest, Innervates, all that, they will do very good damage, and you can handle the mana issues. But you wouldn't want more than that. You would want to stack, maybe the meta is that you have a balanced raid group, then you'd have a good number of shamans, hunters, warlocks, and a couple of other DPSers. You wouldn't have more than 1 or 2 mages in an ideal raid group. And if the meta is go for 12 plus warlocks with a protection paladin, pick every trash pack in the game and AoE it down in seconds, even then mages, more than 1 or 2 mages, aren't going to be wanted by a raid group. So decent class, offers a lot, can do a good amount of damage. They just don't bring the same buffs and debuffs that other classes do, like warlocks, different curses, shamans, totems, hunters, the misdirects. That's kind of the problem mages are in. That's kind of the situation that mages are in. They're not weak. They just don't bring enough to the table to justify more than 1 or 2 or 3 raid spots in the best case scenario. And that's why they get the number 4 spot on this list. In third place, we have the Paladin. Now, the reasoning here is that no raid would really ever need more than 3 Paladins. 1 Holy, 1 Protection, and 1 Retribution. And even then, not for every boss. You can do quite a good number of bosses without a Retribution Paladin, or without a Holy Paladin, or without a Protection Paladin. You don't strictly need to have 3. Sure, It's great if you have all 3 blessings, all 3 judgments, if you have a strong tank healer with a good AoE tank and with Retribution Paladin who is able to keep up all the judgments up. That is good, right? With the 3 different blessings, that is good. But you can manage just fine plenty of bosses without having all 3. And even with those positions, no guild would ever really want more than 1 Prot, 1 Holy, or 1 Ret, so you can imagine the kind of competition that will exist for those kind of spots. I mean, for Holy, if you took away the blessings, the only thing Holy would offer is good, mana-efficient tank healing. And you can manage just fine without that. Ret offers the blessings, the judgments, of course, Judgment of Wisdom being very important for any caster DPS plus hunters, but doesn't do great DPS. And Protection Paladins, sure, they're great, they have a lot of potential, but very few guilds are going to give that kind of position to just a random person. Any decent guild will look to have a solid, reliable player from their roster being their Protection Paladin, given how important tanks are in general, and given how important the Protection Paladin is going to be for clearing raids very quickly and very efficiently. So those are the kind of things you should be aware of if you want to play a Paladin. It's quite a competition to find a raid spot as any spec as a Paladin. And if you're playing as anything other than Protection, it can be difficult to be able to do dungeon groups. Holy isn't the greatest healer. In fact, it's probably the worst healer for 5-man groups. And Retribution, well, melee in general are not great in dungeons in the Burning Crusade, or aren't great in general until tier 6. And even then, they're basically playing catch-up to hunters and warlocks. So Retribution can struggle quite a bit when it comes to doing 5-man dungeons, to finding a raid spot. I mean, you wouldn't even care about the Retribution in Karazhan, like, at all. That's one thing to say. Or Zulaman. You would care about that from a 25-man raiding perspective, however. So these are the kind of things you should be aware about. It's going to be stiff competition to get these kind of raid spots, these guild spots, for any guild, on any level, really. Stiff competition, not many spots, not many guilds really willing to give newcomers a chance if they have a veteran player, as a Protection Paladin or Holy Paladin or Ret Paladin. And that is an issue. For Druids, in contrast, guilds can struggle finding someone to play a Moonkin or a Feral, but for Protection Paladins, not quite as much. Then at number 2, we have Warriors, and from a practical perspective, you could even say that Warriors would deserve the number 1 spot on this list. Why is that? Well, there's an enormous amount of Warrior players right now in Classic, and when guilds will have to shrink for the Burning Crusade, they are going to be the ones that are going to suffer the most, from 10 to 20 raid spots, then 15 raid spots, really, let's be reasonable here for a bit. From those kind of numbers, you're going to end up in a position in the Burning Crusade where guilds may want to have either 2 or 3 warriors in their guild. 1 protection warrior main tank, 1 arms, 1 fury, and one of those DPS warriors having a protection off spec for bosses like Alar, Hydros, Fathom Lord, Carafris, right? And that's only early on. When you look at tier 6, especially tier 6 farming, you wouldn't even need a protection warrior for many of the bosses. For Mount Hyjal can be done by a protection paladin more or less soloing most of it with the help of a feral druid stepping in for certain things, right? Sure, Archimonde, a bit of an exception. Some bosses in Black Temple, you would want the protection warrior, but there's a lot of content past tier 5 that you wouldn't need a warrior for. They are, however, the best tanks in tier 4 and tier 5, just because they have an early game advantage, but they don't scale quite as well as ferals and as paladins, and also because of the way those raids are designed in tier 6 and Sunwell Plateau as well. Now, and that's just for tanking. Now, keeping in mind, getting a tank position in any guild is always difficult, especially a main tank, a warrior main tank position in a guild for tier 4, tier 5, later on. That can be very difficult, of course. And then a DPS position, a melee DPS position, well, Fury is pretty decent damage, but they don't offer anything special that other warriors can't. Like, what does Fury offer? Battle Shout, Thunderclap, Demo Shot, all that, right? Every Arms Warriors and Protection Warriors can offer those things as well. Fury is pretty decent damage, but melee suffer in general, so they don't really have anything special on offer. They can't scale very well with tier 6, Zulaman, Sunwell Plateau gear, but early on they do have some issues, partly because of the way the encounters are designed. And arms can do pretty decent damage, and they do offer 4% physical damage, but here's the thing. You do need a pretty dedicated arms warrior that's willing to gear properly, that's going to go for sword specialization to make it worth it. Because you want that arms warrior to do a certain amount of damage himself so that your overall raid DPS is increased, not decreased, by having him in the raid. So you want a good arms warrior, you would want a good protection warrior. You can do with a good fury warrior, of course. It's not to drag on your raid, but the problem is you're looking at going from 10, 13, 15, 20 warrior spots in vanilla to free, 2 or free. And realistically, you wouldn't use Fury for every boss. You wouldn't use an arms even for every boss. And depends on how dedicated they are. So a great deal of competition for a warrior spot in a guild. More so than most other classes, if not all classes from a practical sense, just because of the ridiculous number of warriors currently playing Classic. Finally, and number 1 as the most undesirable class to play in World of Warcraft, the Burning Crusade, the one class that's on the thumbnail of this video, we have rogues. I don't think I should go into many details, and regardless of what I say, I'll have plenty of angry keyboard warriors furiously typing in the comment section of this video, but here's the reasons why. For dungeons, melee are just not great. Simple as that. But other melee, paladins, warriors, druids, shamans, they have other options. And mind you, an enhancement shaman is perfectly fine in 5-mins. Others, they do have issues. And even shamans, like every melee does struggle with the problems in 5-mins that there's a lot of cleave. There's a lot of mechanics that screw them over, reduce their DPS, get them killed very easily. That's the 5-min situation. For raids, in tier 4 and tier 5, it's much, much worse. Many bosses, a great deal of trash, not favorable towards melee DPS in general. And rogues, as a DPS, they can be fine. The problem is they're very gear dependent. So sure, a rogue with good weapons, with DST, with the Void Reaver trinket, with tier 4 and tier 5 set pieces, with expertise gear from raiding, they can do decent damage. But they offer no real tangible buffs or debuffs with the exception of improved exposed armor. And even then, improved exposed armor is only worth it if the rogue itself is capable of doing a decent amount of DPS so that you can justify them having a raid spot, which they won't do unless they have good gear, but they won't get good gear unless you take them. And why would you take them if they're doing crap DPS to begin with, and with many boss encounters not being favorable towards melee? Enhancement Shamans will do more damage. Fury Warriors will do more damage. Hell, even Rep Paladins will do more damage early on. Now, for Rep Paladins, for Arms Warriors, it's really the fact they have the blacksmithing weapons, which are pretty good. Rogues suffer because they don't have that kind of option with the overpowered blacksmithing weapons that give Paladins, Warriors, Shamans a lot of damage potential early on. Rogues do have that problem, that gearing issue initially. They basically need raid gear. They need arena gear even for a really good offhand. And those are the kind of problems that rogue players would encounter in the best case scenario, really. Mechanics that don't favor them, DPS that's not going to be great until you get full raid gear. And even when you account for all of that, there's the bigger issue. That rogues only become useful for a raid team in tier 6. This is my perspective. I'd have a rogue in my raiding team if I was leading a guild when Burning Crusade Classic comes out. I'd have a rogue in my raiding team. I'd gear him up with tier 4, tier 5, DST and all that purely because of tier 6. Because a rogue really helps you out in Mount Hyjal and in Black Temple. In Mount Hyjal, they're useful because they can distract bosses at the end of waves. There's nothing more frustrating during Mount Hyjal progression or even farming when you wipe because maybe you struggled a bit with some trash. The Asgalore trash is a particular example of this. The Necromancer Banshee wave is particularly annoying there. You can struggle with some of the trash. Maybe you're trying to recover, but you can't because the boss is coming. Well, a rogue can buy you the time you need to recover, and that is useful. That is important for any raiding team. But more vitally important is what they can do in Black Temple. they are really good interrupters, and that's crucial for bosses like Reliquary of Souls and Illidari Council. Having a rogue really helps you deal with those bosses, and they're not easy bosses. On retail, during Retail Burning Crusade, I can attest to this fact. Many guilds struggled on these bosses. They struggled on Reliquary of Souls and Illidari Council. That was a far harder boss as far as I was concerned than Illidan himself. There was this idea that if you could kill Illidari Council on retail, you most certainly were capable as a guild of killing Illidan. And that's something, a class that can really help you out with those kind of bosses is useful to have in a raid. But here's the bigger issue, the far bigger issue. Even if you account for all of that, you're only looking at 1 and at most 2 guild spots, not raid spots, for a rogue in your guild. That's the problem. That's the biggest issue. With at most 1 raid spot, and not even then a guaranteed spot for every boss. You take a rogues on some bosses, but not all of them during progression. You'd obviously take them on farm to gear them up, but during progression, you wouldn't bother for every boss, and that is an issue that rogues would have to deal with. That at most they would have 1 raid spot for them. 2, if you have 2 very good, dedicated, well-geared rogues, sure, you could have 2 as part of your guild, but only in that situation. So realistically, most rogues will be fighting for 1 raid spot in a guild. If that 1 raid spot is even available in the first place, because plenty of guilds will take the view, you know what, we can do Mount Hyjal, we can do Black Temple with our rogue, we don't need them, and why bother carrying a class in tier 4 and tier 5 that doesn't really have that much to offer to us, just so that they are useful in tier 6. Now, I disagree with that logic. I think it is important to think ahead and not just think about tier 4 and tier 5. That's my perspective, but other people wouldn't want to deal with that. So early on especially, rogues would struggle to find any guild to be able to raid in, and might find some guilds once tier 6 is available, and only then. And even then, even when that happens, the rogue spot in tier 6 will likely go to someone who is an officer or friends with an officer or a long-time respected member of a guild. That's the biggest problem. That's why rogues are number 1 on this list. They don't do completely horrible. They do offer improved exposed armor, which once you start really getting into the tier 6 gearing, after a certain point really becomes useful to have a rogue with improved exposed armor to improve your physical DPS, your hunter DPS in particular. A rogue is essential for hunters to do crazy damage, like over 3k DPS, 3.6, 3.8. I've seen hunters do 4k DPS in Burning Crusade, but for that kind of stuff, you need all the buffs and debuffs, including improved exposed armor. But that's basically what the rogues are offering. They're offering mediocre DPS unless they have full tier 6 Sunwell Plateau Zulaman gear with potentially Warglaives. Until that point, they're offering mediocre DPS, with only tangible benefits being distraction on Hyjal bosses, interrupts for certain boss encounters, and an improved exposed armor. That's it. And that will cause them a lot of problems. On top of that, there's a decent number of rogues right now in Classic. And imagine the kind of Hunger game scenario that warriors and rogues will go for when it comes to fighting for the very limited raid spots that they'll have available in a Burning Crusade Classic when it comes out. Questine here on Serious Gaming signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. Stay tuned for more. Make sure you click that bell icon. It is important. And do give me your thoughts and comments below. Stay tuned.